we know that morale is everything when it comes to the fighting in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian soldiers have high morale. Russian soldiers do not.
Good evening to you as well.
Can I ask for your thoughts on the significance of Zelensky's visit to this region at this time?
Well, I think it's very significant in terms of the morale of the troops. They are seeing a cold winter coming down on top of them. They've had a hard fight. There's more fighting to come. When the ground gets a little bit harder, they're going to be right back at it. And so having the boss come and say the things that he said, that is always good for morale for these soldiers. And we know that morale is everything when it comes to the fighting in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian soldiers have high morale. Russian soldiers do not.
Ukraine is thought to have struck Russian air bases on Russian territory. Is this a new reach for Ukrainian military forces?
Not really. There is something new here. Like you said, I think increasing attacks on bases in Russia. If we're going to see more and more of that, then yes, I think that is new, just the frequency of it. But, we have seen them hit in Crimea, which, of course, is part of Ukraine. We've seen them hit in Ukraine there in Crimea, but also a couple of times in Russia. But I think if we see more and more of this reaching out and touching the Russians in their own homeland, it's taking the war to the Russians. And I think it shows a real cheekiness for the Ukrainians to be really pushing out, not just from the fighting there within Ukraine, but actually taking it to the Russians.
Zelensky's visit comes just a day after these explosions hit two airfields. And as mentioned, this was deep inside Russia. Moscow has blamed this on Ukrainian drones. What difference does this make, if any, to the wider war effort?
Well, it reminds me of some of the dark days for the United States in World War II, where we had a small air mission flown from the USS Hornet out in the Pacific, the small aircraft carrier. They launched bombers that hit Japan, and that was a tremendous morale boost for the United States during those early dark days. And it's something similar here, where these kinds of attacks, if you're in a Ukraine village and you're occupied by the Russians and you're being tormented by them, and you hear that, in fact, Ukraine has been able to bomb places in Russia, to make the Russians feel what it's like to be at war themselves, I think that does a lot for the morale of those people in those small villages during this wintertime. So maybe in terms of military effects, it's not as great as a massive attack of some type, but in terms of morale for for the Ukraine people and for the Ukraine military, I think those kinds of attacks mean everything.
How about reflecting on Western supplied weapons being used in this way? What does that tell us about the war effort?
Well, that's a really good point. There has been reluctance in Washington to provide Ukraine with particularly artillery and missile systems that have a far range, because there's fear that Ukraine would use it against Russian targets in Russia, and that would lead to an escalation. And I think what we're seeing right now is that whether we provide them the weaponry or not, they're going to use drones and they're going to take this fight to the Russians. And I think really that's a lesson for Washington, to not be wringing your hands all the time about providing the so-called ATACMS, long-range missiles and this type of thing, that in fact this fear of escalation is not well-founded, and the Ukrainians are going to be doing this regardless. So I think in terms of teaching the West a bit of a lesson about Ukraine, I think that's certainly something coming from these attacks into Russia by Ukraine.
Much being said about a very tough winter ahead in Ukraine. How difficult is the task ahead of President Zelensky?
Well, this tough winter is going to be felt in Ukraine and in Europe too. In the UK, it's going to be felt in the US too, but not like it is in Europe and not like it is in the UK and Ukraine. And for Zelensky, as well as for governments throughout Europe, it's going to be leadership to keep the nations together, to keep the people understanding that we have got to sacrifice the way Ukraine is doing in terms of dealing with the wintertime, dealing with some of the hardship for some people that come from inflation and high energy prices, that we have to do this for Ukraine. And that is the kind of thing that has to be undertaken by leaders who make sure that everyone understands why this is happening and the importance of it. So for Zelensky, he's going to have a tough time in Ukraine, taking care as best he can of the needs of the Ukraine people, as well as inspiring the West to provide the kind of leadership needed for us to make it through this winter as well. So Zelensky's going to be playing both at home and away in terms of this winter.
And how about Ukraine's potential NATO membership? Is there any timeline, do you think, on that?
Well, I think NATO membership is a bit of a longer timeline. I think the timeline that is today's timeline and tomorrow's timeline is to help Ukraine win the war. They've got to get in there, and we've got to help them continue to push back on the Russians. NATO membership, I hope NATO membership will come, but we've got some work to do first, and that's to beat the Russians in Ukraine. And I think we will then have to talk seriously about NATO membership for Ukraine once we've taken care of the Russians. We cannot, no matter what happens on the battlefield, leave Ukraine in a gray zone, in a never land, a no man's zone. Once this fighting stops, they're always going to be a target of the Russians, and we've got to pull them into the alliance. But let's beat the Russians first.
How about some of the comments we've been hearing from the French President Emmanuel Macron, sparking a bit of an outcry this past weekend by saying the West must consider security guarantees for Russia if it returns to the negotiating table? What do you make of that?
Well, that was a bit of a surprise. Yes, I think this has been quite the topic of conversation over the past few days after he made that discussion. I think when we talk about security guarantees, it's got to be for Ukraine first. Ukraine is the one that has been invaded by the aggressor, Russia. I understand where he's coming from, though. He's talking about some type of grand bargain, grand deal down the road, where we're all sitting around a table, or certainly Ukraine and Russia will be sitting around a table. But that's a long way away, and I think it's a bit premature to talk about security guarantees or talk about anything for Russia. I think right now we got to be focused on Ukraine. We got to be focused on the war in Ukraine. And if we're going to talk about security guarantees, first in line is going to be Ukraine. And but let's get this war under our belts and finished first. And then let's get into things like security guarantees for Ukraine, membership in NATO for Ukraine, and then where does Russia play in all this?
You say getting Putin and Zelensky together around the table is a long way away. How long do you think that is?
Well, it will take as long as it takes for these two adversaries to fight it out. There's a lot more fighting to be done. Both sides have doubled down on their goals and objectives. Zelensky wants his country back. Russia seems to want to, at a minimum, take the East. And there's no one that's saying they're ready to sit down and talk. We're going to have to, unfortunately, watch this tragedy continue to unfold and this war to go on until the sides have exhausted themselves and are ready to talk. Talking will come, but right now, I'm afraid there's war fighting to be done.
And when the talking does come, is there a sense that Moscow's perspective will have to be taken into account?
Well, we're going to have to take Russia into account in a couple of ways. One is they're not going anywhere. They're geographically located in Europe. They're in your backyard. They're in Ukraine's backyard. So we're going to have to figure out what to do with a Russia that right now is almost beyond redemption. An aggressive Putin and whoever might follow Putin will have to deal with an aggressive Russia that could strike out when it's stronger and has rearmed itself, could strike out in another direction. Maybe it's Estonia this time. Moldova, there's a lot of targets, Georgia, that Russia could take on in the years to come. So we have to deal with this kind of Russia. So, I'm not so sure it's a matter of taking into account Russian strategic position as much as it is how can we deter a nation like Russia that is on an aggressive bent for the foreseeable future. How do we keep them in a box? That's what we're going to have to try to figure out, and this is going to take a long time to do. We're in a very different place these days, and this is going to go on for years to come, I'm afraid.
Can I ask just finally on a story being reported in a number of papers, actually, the Daily Telegraph front page tomorrow morning runs with a headline, Orban blocks EU plan to raise £15 billion for Kyiv. This is Hungary having £15.5 billion, that's $18 billion blocked in EU aid, meant to be going to Ukraine in an effort to force Brussels to release frozen funds to Budapest. The European Commission said last week it wouldn't pay the £11.5 billion in EU funds in coronavirus recovery money to Hungary because of concerns over corruption. Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, being accused here of being soft on Putin. What do you make of this?
Well, it's a tremendous disappointment that Orban would choose this time to try to extort the EU or extort funding or to try to manipulate things to go in his direction. I'm not surprised. I shouldn't sit here and act like I'm surprised. We've seen this from Orban before, but I think it shows the job that we have ahead of us to keep Europe together. When you have, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey, or whether it's Orban in Hungary, where we have leadership in these two countries that are using this tense situation to try to get things for themselves. It's a pity that we're seeing this, but this is where European or transatlantic leadership, including the United States, including the UK, where we're going to have to stand up to these two leaders. Orban, in this case, it's pathetic, and I hope Brussels has some tricks up its sleeves to try to push back on Orban and not give him, not give in to his extortion. We'll just have to see. But it just shows that the work we have ahead in terms of leadership and in terms of dealing with Hungary, and it also shows how hard it is for us to maintain unity and trying to figure out what you do with leaders like this, whether it's in Ankara or it's in Budapest. How do we deal with these totalitarians who are acting this way?